So good evening, everybody, and it's a real pleasure to be here to introduce our Grand Challenge lecture this evening. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Pauline Walsh, and I'm the Pro Vice-Chancellor Executive Dean for the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences and a member of the ILAS Steering Committee. So welcome to the Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at Keele University. And through a number of different activities, fellowship programmes, research workshops and events, it's about promoting interdisciplinarity. And I'd like to welcome everyone from across the university and those of you that are visitors to the university, including the Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences students who are here this evening as well. So welcome to all of you. Grand Challenge lectures are about stimulating discussion and thought across the different disciplines. And tonight is our third event in the series. And it's a real pleasure to see the room so full of people here this evening. And we've first of all, before I introduce Kate, I want to just go through some housekeeping. So we don't expect a fire alarm to happen, but if there should be one, then you would go through the doors to the rear and then out onto the right and congregate outside. And for those of you that don't know, the building toilet facilities are just outside and along the corridor. So I'm really pleased to introduce Professor Kate Pickett. And Kate is a Professor of Epidemiology in the Department of Health Sciences at the University of York. She's also the university's champion for research on justice and equality. Kate trained in biological anthropology at Cambridge, nutritional sciences at Cornell, and epidemiology at UC Berkeley. And her research focuses on the social determinants of well-being. Kate spent 16 years in Chicago before coming to York in 2003. Kate was a UK National Institute for Health Research, the NIHR, career scientist from 2007 to 12. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, and a Fellow of the UK Faculty of Public Health. She is perhaps most widely known as the co-author with Richard Wilkinson of The Spirit Level, Why More Equal Societies Almost Always Do Better. Published in 2009, at the time when the world was reeling in grips of the global financial crisis and from the excesses of the periods, the book highlighted the pernicious effects that inequality have on societies, eroding trust, increasing anxiety and illness, and encouraging excessive consumption. It was a book of its time which captured the zeitgeist of the late noughties. It was chosen as one of the top 10 books of the decade by the New Statesman, winner of Publication of the Year by the Political Studies Association, winner of the 2010 Bristol Festival of Ideas Book Prize, and translated into 25 languages. Richard and Kate were awarded a 2013 Silver Rose Award from Solidar for championing equality, and the 2014 Charles Cully Medal of the Irish Cancer Society. Kate is also a co-founder and trustee of the Equality Trust. She was a commissioner for the York Fairness Commission and for the National Living Wage Commission. She sits on the Scientific Council of Inequality Watch, the Scientific Board of Progressive Economy, and is a member of the Human Capital Research Working Group of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. She is on the steering committee of the Alliance for Sustainability and Prosperity. Lots and lots of different things, and clearly, a very influential person. Kate's lecture tonight considers the immorality of inequality. Here she will examine whether or not there are arguments in favour of inequality and how the impact of inequality on the economy, the environment, population health, human capital development, and social relationships can be viewed within a human rights and social justice perspective. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to invite Professor Kate Pickett up to the stage.
Thank you very much, Pauline, for that embarrassing introduction. It's a bit jack of all trades, master of none, I think, listed out like that. And thank you all for coming. It's very kind of you. I'm always impressed that anybody goes out in the evening to listen to a lecture when they could be home enjoying time in front of the television and eating something nice. So I'm really grateful to you all for attending, and I'm really happy to be here. And it's perhaps a particularly good day to be here talking about the immorality of inequality because it's budget day. Now, normally I listen to the budget, and sometimes I'm even asked to comment on the budget, but today I was on the train coming over here, so I've been trying to sort of play catch-up with what was going on, and you all may know more about the details of what was in the budget than I do, but I certainly think that one can look at it with a moral lens and find it somewhat wanting. So when I was thinking about this lecture, I was doing something rather uncomfortable. I was trying to put myself in the shoes of Margaret Thatcher, which are not as glamorous as the shoes of Theresa May, but I was trying to imagine what it was like to be there in sort of 1979, in the early 80s, thinking about how you wanted to structure your society and your economy and who you would be listening to and what you would be thinking about. Because it was in that period, under Thatcher and Reagan, that we saw the modern rise of inequality as a result of their adoption of neoliberal ideology and the economics that went alongside that. And this cartoon, where we have two skeletons sitting in a boat labelled the 99%, one of them is saying to the other, they say a rising tide lifts all boats, and the other one says, do they say when? Because this was the promise of neoliberalism. We were told, and many believed, that if we allowed free market capitalism to the greatest extent, if we deregulated, if we fostered individualism, that would unleash creativity, we would have unprecedented economic growth, and that would be a rising tide that lifted all boats, and we would all benefit. What happened was an astonishing rise in inequality that went alongside the adoptions of those tendencies. So what we're looking at here, and I realise that for those of you at the back, you're having to sort of squint at a screen over there, but for those of you who are sort of in the middle, you've got the worst of both worlds. You haven't got the back screen and you're not close to the front screen. So I'll do my best to sort of talk through things, but that means I have to leave the microphone. What we're looking at here are changes in inequality over time. We're starting in 1920, going up to 2010. And we're just seeing the change in inequality for a number of different countries. The United States, United Kingdom is this red line. We've got Canada, Germany, Japan, France, and what they're calling on this chart Sweden, which is actually Sweden. That's quite possibly my typo. But all the countries demonstrating this same pattern. So in the early 20th century, we had very high levels of inequality. And then they came plummeting down from sort of 1930s onwards, but particularly post-war. We had a period of much greater equality in all these countries, and then in the early 1980s went shooting up again. So we are now in the UK at levels of inequality that we haven't seen since the Edwardian era. So all of those changes have been completely reversed. And this pattern is very, very common. So this rise coincides with neoliberal economics, but does it matter? A lot of people then, and indeed some people now, would argue that it doesn't matter. That inequality is a side effect of those neoliberal policies, and it's just sort of a necessary evil, but it doesn't matter that much. And some people will even state that they think inequality is beneficial in some ways. So the kind of ideas that are put out by people who are either not bothered by inequality or think it's actually good for us include the idea that we can't have economic growth without inequality. The two go hand in hand, and if we want that economic growth, then we're just going to have to put up with the rise in inequality. Then there's the argument that actually inequality is good for us because it promotes aspirations. If you lived in a very equal society, why would you bother? Why would you try hard? Why would you have aspirations? Why would you want to be creative? And then some people think, well, inequality doesn't really matter, it's poverty that matters. And we don't need to worry about the gap between the rich and the poor, we only need to worry about the poor and the proportion of the population that is poor and what is happening to them. And then there's another idea that actually, of course we're going to have unequal societies because that's what we're like. We are nasty humans, we are individualistic, aggressive, competitive, we're out for ourselves. That is human nature. So why try and do anything about inequality? Because that's the nature of the beast, and the beast is us. We are beastly. In this cartoon, the son's sitting on his dad's lap, and his dad is saying it goes in cycles, Junior. Sometimes the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Sometimes the rich get richer and the poor stay the same. You know, just this idea that, you know, can't do anything about this inequality. It's human nature, it's what society is like. But if we go back one slide, of course, we can see societies are not fixed in their levels of inequality. It goes up and down. We can be more equal. We have been in the past. We could be more unequal. You know, we have been in the past. So it's certainly not a sort of fixed state of any particular culture. And we do need to examine what it does and whether it matters. So I want to take that first idea that you need some inequality in order to have economic growth, and I'm only going to spend like 1 minute on it. That is not true. And that's all I need to say. The facts show it indisputably. It is not true. This is a chart looking at developed countries and whether or not there's any correlation between income redistribution and growth, between inequality and growth. And there is nothing. There's not even a hint of a relationship. And this is backed up by analyses coming out of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, not really known for their progressive economic tendencies, but they say there is no evidence that inequality and economic growth are related, and in fact, more evidence tends towards the idea that inequality inhibits economic growth than that it advances it. So we can just dismiss that one. If you're lucky, I'll be through them all in about 10 minutes. You're not going to be that lucky. So what about this idea that inequality improves people's aspirations, improves creativity, makes people want to strive to get ahead? That's wrong too. So this is a chart linking social mobility to income inequality. And if you talk to politicians across the political spectrum, so politicians on the left, politicians on the right, they will all agree that equality of opportunity is a good thing. We should all be playing on a level playing field. We should all have the same opportunities. They don't really think often that inequality's got anything to do with it, because that's inequality of outcomes, not opportunities. But they are intimately linked. This chart comes from a World Bank report looking at a number of different countries. It's looking at a measure of social mobility, and you can ask me in the question time if you want what that is. It's quite technical, but it's to do with whether or not, you know, children can move up and down in society irrespective of their parents' social class or incomes. And social mobility turns out to be much more possible in more equal societies. So that if we look at the rich, developed countries here, the United States has the worst social mobility and the highest income inequality of that group of countries. So far from being the land of opportunity, it's actually where you are least likely to be able to realize your aspirations and be socially mobile. So we often say that if you want to live the American dream, you should go to Denmark, because it's far more possible there. So it seems as if you can't have equality of opportunity without greater equality of outcome. It's as if in more unequal societies, the social ladder is steeper and the rungs are further apart, and it's harder to move up or down. And why is that? Well, in part, it's because of educational inequalities and what inequality does to children's well-being and their educational trajectories. So I want to show you this graph, and it is a bit complicated, so I will try and do it carefully. It's a version of what's become known in the social sciences and in political circles as the killer graph, because its conclusions are so devastating. The first killer graph turned out to have a mistake in it, so it wasn't quite so killing. But this more recent version does not have that problem. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at 6 groups of children from Key Stage 1 through Key Stage 2, 3, 4, 5, on to university, and how they're scoring on standardized tests at each of those times. And we have, at the start, in Key Stage 1, 2 groups of children who score high. They're doing really well on those standardized tests. Some of them, Group 1, come from affluent, well-off, middle-class families. Group 2 come from poorer, working-class families, but they're all scoring high, those 2 groups. We have a group in the middle who are scoring average. Some of those are from affluent families, Group 3. Some are not, Group 4. And then at the bottom we have the kids who are not scoring very well at Key Stage 1 on those standardized tests. Some of them are from affluent middle-class backgrounds, and some are not. But then what we do is look over time to see how those kids are doing. If you scored high early on and you came from a well-off background, you continue scoring high all the way through your educational trajectory. But if you were scoring high initially and you came from a less well-off background, from the most deprived, then your scores tend to decline over time. And the longer you're in education, the more they decline. And in fact, by Key Stage 3, you've been overtaken by the average kids from middle-class backgrounds. They're now doing better than you were. If you were scoring low at the start, you come from a middle-class background, you do some catching up. Come from a poorer background, not so much. But it's this crossover between different groups that means it's called the killer graph, because it suggests that whatever your natural abilities when you enter the school system, your educational trajectory is going to be shaped by your social class, to such an extent that your natural talent and capabilities are diminished the longer you spend in education. Now, we know that the gap between educational attainment among the richest and the poorest, that gap is bigger in more unequal societies. And this is part of the reason why. We also know that child well-being is affected more generally by inequality, and you can't expect children to do well educationally if their well-being is compromised. If we look at the UNICEF index of child well-being over a decade, we can see it improving in countries that became slightly more unequal and declining in countries that became more unequal over a decade. And I just want to point out here Sweden. Sweden's child well-being declined as its income inequality increased. It has the fastest growing inequality in the OECD. So although child well-being is still very high in Sweden, or Sweden, as I often want to spell it, it's not as good as it was. And it's exactly as worse now as we would predict if all we knew was its change in income inequality. We also know that inequality is related to dropping out of high school across American states, lower average scores on literacy, science, and maths in different countries. So what we're really doing when we have very unequal societies is we're wasting huge amounts of human talent. We're wasting huge amounts of human capital, as the economists describe it. And so no wonder we don't get great social mobility in those unequal societies. And it's hard to measure creativity, but we did look at a measure which you might think would be a reasonable proxy, which is the number of patents granted per head of population, and that is higher in more equal societies than in the more unequal ones. So there seems to be nothing about inequality that creates those benefits that some people think come from inequality. Aspirations, social mobility, and creativity. It seems actually, in some sense, to do the opposite. We were quite glad to come across this graph recently. It's looking at the performance of companies over 10 years, how much they return to their shareholders, so how well they're doing on their profits. And we're plotting two lines here. The red line is the performance of companies where the chief executive was paid above average for large companies. And the grey line is the profitability of companies where the chief executive was paid less than the median. You know, so sometimes people say, oh, you know, if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys and things like that. Well, you get smart monkeys if you pay peanuts, and more productive, beneficial monkeys, it seems. So there doesn't seem to be that relationship between talent at the top and performance and brilliance. And we all know that from the financial crisis, don't we? We've all sat and watched those select committees and those Senate committee hearings, and we've seen those bankers sitting there admitting they actually didn't know anything about banking. And yes, they didn't manage to predict things that were going to happen, and yes, they were responsible for the crash. So not a lot of benefits in that way from inequality. So what about the idea that it just doesn't matter really very much because it's only poverty that matters? Well, that was what our book, Richard Wilkinson and my book, was all about. It was full of graphs. You know, it was amazing that people read it and said nice things about it because it was full of graphs. And one of the things we realized when we had it in manuscript at first is people don't like graphs. I like them, and Richard likes them because that's our bread and butter. We look at them every day and we're sort of fond of them. You know, we have the sort of picture tells 1,000 words kind of thing. We really like a graph, but most people don't. So we've taken to showing this one because it says all you need to know. And you know, we didn't really need to spend 300 pages and 500 references on making the point that, you know, you get more inequality, you get more problems. But the slightly more complex version of that is this one. We made an index of health and social problems. It includes health problems like the average life expectancy in different places, infant mortality rates, levels of obesity, and levels of mental illness. So it's got health outcomes in it. It's also got things to do with children's life chances, human capital development. It's got maths and literacy scores of 15-year-olds. It's got teenage births, and it's got social mobility. But it's also got measures of how well society is functioning, what the relationships are like among people in society. So it's got the murder rate, levels of trust, and imprisonment. And we chose all of those variables to look at, all those factors to look at, because you can get good data on them, comparable data in different places, reliable data, and because they all have a social gradient. They're more common at the bottom of society, less common at the top, but it's a gradient, so that even if you're just below the top, you have a lower life expectancy than if you're at the very top. And we put them all into an index together, and we looked at them in relation to income inequality, and that's what we found. So much higher levels of health and social problems in the more unequal countries. So on this graph, we've got Japan and the Scandinavian countries doing much better than UK, Portugal, and the USA, who have a much higher level of health and social problems. And that relationship is so close, it looks more like a physics experiment than social sciences, really. Now, it's also true in the United States, because we knew that our work might be politically controversial, perhaps didn't anticipate quite how much or how painful that would be, but we knew that some people would think we picked these countries just to sort of suit our argument, and also that everything can be explained by culture. You know, there's something weird about the Scandinavian countries. They're not like us. There's something weirdly hostile about the English-speaking countries. They're not like us. I mean, you don't have to look at this for very long to see that that's a silly argument. We've got Portugal here and Spain there, culturally very similar, doing very differently. You can take the English-speaking countries and the Scandinavian countries and Japan off this chart, and you've still got a relationship between health and social problems and inequality. But anyway, we thought we'd do it all again in a different setting, so we did it all again, same index for the 50 US states. Not as close a correlation, other things are affecting those health and social outcomes, but fewer health and social problems in the more equal states than the more unequal. We've got Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama up there, down here, Utah, Wisconsin, Iowa, New Hampshire. And we also knew that people might think we'd just picked those outcomes to look at, those health and social problems to look at just to suit ourselves. So we did it all again with somebody else's index, and we used the UNICEF index of child well-being and found exactly the same thing. Child well-being is higher in more equal societies. There's Sweden at the top, although we know it's now declined. And the UK came absolute bottom. Some of you will remember that report coming out in 2007, because it's one of the few times that we actually did worse than the USA. We're quite good at some aspects of child well-being in the UK, traffic accidents, but we're really bad at almost everything else, and we did particularly badly at underage sex, binge drinking, and our children not finding their peers kind and helpful. I'll just show you one of those individual health problems that we looked at. And it's really just to sort of think about the scale of the issue. So this is the prevalence of mental illness in different countries. How many people in the population, what proportion of the population have had some kind of mental illness in the past year? And in the more equal societies, it's 10 or less out of 100. Australia and the UK, 23 out of 100, and more than a quarter in the USA. So, 2 to 3-fold differences in the level of mental illness closely related to inequality. But I think we were most struck not so much by the health outcomes that we were looking at, because both Richard and I are epidemiologists. We understand the impact of chronic stress. We know what it can do to the body. It's almost like more rapid aging. And so it was quite sort of easy for us to hypothesize about how inequality might get under the skin and cause levels of chronic stress that would cause worse health outcomes. But I think we were surprised by the impact on relationships in society and what inequality does to the functionality or dysfunctionality of a society. We were surprised to find strong differences in the levels of trust. In more equal countries, about 2/3 of the population trust other people. It's less than 1/5 in the most unequal. Same pattern across US states. And this matters because if you're a child on a playground, or a woman walking home alone at night, or anybody on public transport or in a public space, or you're in your work environment, levels of trust among the people around you, the people who you encounter, the people you might meet, are really important. It seems to affect as well how much we participate in our society. So this is a civic participation score, much, much higher in more equal societies. People more likely to vote, people more likely to read newspapers, people more likely to belong to community organisations or political parties or clubs, etc. So people get involved more in more equal societies. And when you lose trust and you lose that sense of community, bad things happen. You know, the murder rate goes up. There are well over 50 studies of income inequality and violent crime showing a consistent relationship, and over time, so that as societies become more unequal, you see the murder rate go up. These are Canadian provinces, those blue triangles down there, and the red dots are American states. There are about 15 murders per million people per year in the more equal Canadian provinces, and about 150, 10 times more in the more unequal American states. Tenfold differences, closely related to inequality. When the level of violence goes up, imprisonment rates go up. And here we have levels of imprisonment in relation to income inequality. Now, this is a rather odd chart because the scale up here is on a log scale. And for those of you who immediately put your fingers in your ears and don't know what that is and I don't want to know, it just means that the distance up this scale between 10 and 100 is the same as between 100 and 1,000. We had to put this chart on a log scale because otherwise we couldn't fit the USA on there. Curling up, off the screen, up there. But if you know a country's level of income inequality, you can predict really closely its level of imprisonment. And it's not that driven by crime rates. It is much more to do with how harsh the judicial system is. Whether or not when a person comes into the criminal justice system, you send them to prison or you give them a community sentence. It's to do with how long they get sent away for and how likely it is that they might reoffend when they come out. We've recently looked at the age at which children are considered to be criminally responsible. That's related to inequality too. So the whole system gets harsher, more punishing in more unequal societies. So we've got trust declining, civic participation declining, violent crimes going up, levels of imprisonment going up. If you go to countries that are even more unequal than the ones that we study, and for various reasons we study the rich, developed market economies, but if you go to even more unequal societies, you can see the impact of inequality on the urban landscape. So this is a picture we took in Mexico when we were there, and in Cuernavaca, Mexico, where every house has railings and spikes and razor wire curved along the top. And people are frightened of one another and barricade themselves off from one another. In South Africa, we took this picture, even worse. We've still got the spikes on the gates, but now we've got an electric fence, run the razor wire. If you make it over there, someone will come and shoot you. Armed response, this notice says. And just in case they miss and you manage to get over the electric fence, there's 2 enormous dogs waiting for you. And if you look at unequal societies around the world, that's what happens. People become fearful of one another. They want to segregate themselves and shut themselves away. We see it in the gated communities of the United States. We were so amused but horrified. A filmmaker made a film inspired by our book, and one of the things she did was talk to a woman who was living in a gated community, and it was quite moving and sad. But at the end of the film, the woman said, You know what's really sad? Some people in this community want to have an inner gate. They want to have a gated community within the gated community because they think the tone has been lowered and they want it to be even more exclusive. But this is what happens to relationships among people when inequality becomes too high. And you end up spending a lot more people being employed in what's called guard labour in more unequal societies. So that's security people, police, all of the things you need to do to guard people from one another. And 2 dots here, this is the United States in 1979 and then in 2000, which is where that huge rise in inequality happened, and the proportion of the workforce working in guard labour shot up as well. And what a waste of all of our human capabilities to be, carrying guns around and worrying about shooting one another and protecting our things from one another. So inequality is undoubtedly very, very damaging to a whole range of problems. And that evidence grows and grows all the time. It's getting more and more robust. We're getting lots of studies now that look at changes in inequality and changes in health and social problems. But some people sort of still have this idea that it's poverty that matters, that we shouldn't worry about inequality, we should only worry about whether or not people are poor. And one of the things that Richard and I have been very inspired by is this study by Walker on poverty across the world. And I haven't put that up for you to pretend you can read it. I've put it up just to remind me to talk about it. But what Walker did was he talked to poor people in lots of different places around the world, including in Pakistan, in Norway, in the UK, in African countries, and whatever. And the levels of material poverty differed hugely across those different places. So if you're poor in Pakistan, then probably you have a dirt floor, probably you don't have indoor sanitation, your children aren't going to school, etc. Your health is probably very compromised. If you're a poor person in Norway, you've probably got a 3-bedroom house and central heating, and you've probably got quite a lot of material stuff. But what Walker found was that the experience of poverty was exactly the same in all of those places, and the predominant feeling that people had who were poor was shame. They felt ashamed of their circumstances and ashamed of their inability to provide for their families. They felt stigmatized, but they felt guilty. And it was the same whatever the level of material function. So to be poor relative to other people is what matters, not the amount of goods that you have. So I'm not saying that poverty doesn't matter, or indeed that we don't have some absolute poverty in this country, which is growing, and particularly for children. But relative poverty is what makes people feel awful. So inequality matters in part because it makes that experience of poverty even worse. Because if a society is all about achievement and income and who's got what and who can buy what, then it's even worse to be relatively poor. And we do know that income inequality affects everybody. I was going to show you a chart of that, but I've decided it's too complicated for me to think about talking through. What we find when we look at health, when we look at education, when we look at different things, we find that the poor are the most affected by inequality, but the effects run right the way up society. So that even among the most educated, the highest incomes, high social class, if you live in a more unequal society, your health will be worse than your counterparts in a more equal society. Your children will be less likely to do well in school. Your life expectancy will be a bit shorter, etc. And this is so much the case that our colleagues at Harvard School of Public Health refer to income inequality as a social pollutant, because it affects everybody like air pollution affects everybody. You can't escape it. If you live in an unequal society, we're all affected. So I'm going to skip that one. Oh, no, I'm going to go to that one. One of the things that we were really doing all the time in the spirit level was looking at average performance in different places, in different US states, in different countries. Is life expectancy on average lower? Is educational achievement on average lower? And those summary statistics are important, but they don't really convey the entire picture of what's going on in society. So if I said to you, well, you know, to live in a really unequal society like the UK might mean your life expectancy, on average, is 6 months shorter than France. You wouldn't think that mattered very much. But those averages hide huge inequalities within societies. And I think in some ways, those help people to realize the immorality of inequality in a much starker fashion. So I just want to show you one or two things. One, some of you may have seen before, because this is very, very famous, and I realize it needs some tidying up here, but it's a chart produced by the Public Health Observatory in London when it still existed, and it's just a way of conveying life expectancy differences across a city. So it's showing life expectancies for different areas of London, and it shows what happens as you move along the Jubilee line. So we start out in Westminster, where male life expectancy, when they did this, was 77.7 years, and female 84.2. There's an inequality. But as you go along the Jubilee line and end up in Canning Town, male life expectancy has dropped to 71.6. So we've got a 6-year difference in life expectancy across one city for men, and about a 4-year difference for women. So pretty much for men, you lose a year of life expectancy with every stop along the Jubilee line. This is a metaphor. It's okay to go on the Jubilee line. I did have a student ask me that the other day, and I realized I'd obviously really not done a good job of explaining what I meant, because she said, what is going on the underground? That's a big difference. But it can be even worse in some other places in Britain. And this is a chart that Sir Michael Marmot, who did the government's most recent report on health inequalities under the last Labour government. Conservative governments never commission reports on health inequalities. This chart shows life expectancy in Colton in the UK at 54 years. Does anybody know where Colton is? Glasgow. It's Glasgow, yeah. Lenzie, 82. Anybody know where Lenzie is? Scotland. It's Scotland. So we've got 82 years, 54 years. Shockingly huge differences. If we look at the US, we've got Washington, D.C., the black population, 63 years, Montgomery County down the road, 80 years. I've seen Australian statistics comparing Aboriginal life expectancy to white European extraction Australians, life expectancy differences of 20 years. So once you kind of get your statistical microscope focused slightly differently and stop looking at averages and start looking at gaps, then you can really see the damage done by inequality. In January this year, The Guardian published this headline. They said poverty in the UK is jeopardising children's health, warns landmark report. And that report said that poverty is bad for children's health, which wasn't really landmark news. They said that if you're in the lowest social class, your risk of having a baby die in the first year of life was twice that than if you were in the top social class. That is exactly what was reported in the Black Report in 1980. Hardly landmark. And they also said that our children in the UK are not doing as well as children in some other countries, like Swindon and Denmark and the Netherlands. And we've known that since at least 2007. So we keep sort of it's as if we keep pretending we've rediscovered something which actually we've known for so long. And not only is infant mortality higher among the lower social classes than the upper ones, and has been for a long time, it's now rising. Since 2010, the infant mortality of those in manual social classes in the UK has risen. And this is unprecedented, because you know what happens in countries over time? Infant mortality goes down. Everywhere, all over the world, down, 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 down. Sometimes it goes down faster, sometimes it goes down slower, but it goes down. It's going up here. It's going up since 2010. It's going up for the poor. You know what else is going up? Deaths among the elderly. The mortality rates for the over 65s have been increasing since 2010. That increase is accelerating, and the older you are, the faster it is accelerating. Our frail elderly are dying at higher rates since 2010 than they were before. Suicides are up since 2010, and a number have been linked to work capability assessments. Life expectancy gains have slowed down. So all of the gains that, you know, a society ought to be able to expect as it improves its health technology and improves its economic standards of living, we're not getting those anymore in the UK. Since 2010, they've disappeared or they've been reversed. And health inequalities, which were narrowing over that entire period of Labour government, they came down, mostly because of reductions in child and pensioner poverty. Those gaps are widening again. We know that inequality is related to people's anxiety about their status. If you live in a high inequality country, you have more status anxiety whether you are poor or rich. And that anxiety about status provokes people into different sorts of reactions. Some people get depressed. That's depression in relation to inequality in more unequal states. Some people take the opposite way, the opposite kind of reaction to status anxiety and worry. Instead of kind of going under and getting depressed, they try to sort of big themselves up and sort of tough it out. Self-enhancement is higher in more unequal societies. And self-enhancement is that thing of thinking you're better than other people, right? You're a better driver than average, you're better looking, you're more intelligent, you're nicer. People are more likely to say those things in more unequal societies, so you won't be surprised to see a rise in narcissism in the United States. I know what you're all thinking. And it's rump with a silent T, isn't it? In relation to income inequality. And some people don't necessarily get depressed, don't necessarily get narcissistic, but they do things to relieve themselves from the pain of their anxiety. This is problem gambling, but we could see the same rise in problematic behaviours related to alcohol and drugs and comfort eating and retail therapy in relation to inequality. So inequality has all these terrible, terrible impacts. It's not just poverty. So we certainly should care, but we also need to think about inequality when we're thinking about our environment, because what else happens when societies become more materialistic and individualistic? This is what happens. We buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like, which my son tells me comes from a popular film, which I have not seen. All the young people here will know, but it's from Fight Club. We overconsume, because that's how we show our status. You can buy a Louis Vuitton trash bag. Nice, isn't it? You know you all want one of those. If you feel embarrassed about your inability to buy designer goods, you can go on eBay and buy some shopping bags, designer shopping bags, empty, used by someone else, so that you can go to Primark and put your purchases in a Gucci bag. There are studies now linking inequality to conspicuous consumption, high status cars, internet searches for status goods. And my colleague Danny Dorling, who is a geographer at University of Oxford, has a range of charts like these on his website, linking inequality to water consumption, meat consumption, CO2 emissions, number of flights that people take. I've seen inequality related to the number of trips that people make by bicycle. It's related to recycling. It's related to whether or not business leaders think that the government should comply with environmental regulations. It's intimately linked to our ability to make that transition to sustainable economies, because if people keep wanting more and more, then it's going to be really challenging to make that change. The last point I want to make is to do with this idea that we are nasty and brutish and aggressive and competitive and out for ourselves, and that's just human nature. It's not. We are like that, or we can be like that, but we don't have to be like that. We're also very, very good at being affiliative, egalitarian, cooperative, supportive. And we've spent much, much more of our time as anatomically modern human beings in egalitarian, sharing, caring communities than we've spent in hierarchies. Now, we can obviously do both. We are incredibly adaptable, but there is nothing about our human nature that is inherently competitive, inherently individualistic, or inherently aggressive. And in fact, everything we've learned in social epidemiology over the past 30 years tells us how important social relationships are, how important our friendships are for our health, how important our intimate partnerships are for our health, how important social support is, and community and social capital. So just a couple of final thoughts on immorality. Oxfam produced this statistic a few years ago. Oxfam have started going to Davos every year, to the World Economic Forum, and each time publishing a report on inequality. They've got a 10-year campaign on inequality, and they used to just be a poverty charity. And they said that the 85 richest people on the planet own the same wealth as the 3.5 billion poorest people, which is a shocker, isn't it? But last year, it was 8. Oh, I'm so glad to hear you gasping with shock and horror. And world leaders are talking about inequality now in ways they never have before. Barack Obama, the Pope, Christine Lagarde, the director of the International Monetary Fund, and Ban Ki-moon when he was UN Secretary General. And at the World Economic Forum last year, the forum decided that inequality was the greatest challenge facing the world over the next decade. So at some level, there's now a recognition and an agreement that inequality is a bad thing. See any reflection of that in our budget today? If we just took the increased wealth gained by the 1,000 richest people in the UK, that's not very many people, about 10 times what's in this room, let's say we taxed all of that increased wealth just on those 1,000 people, we could pay the adult social care bill for 4 years. So it's not beyond the wit of man or woman or chancellor to come up with a progressive taxation scheme that would fund our social care properly for as long as we wanted. Our decision not to do so is political. Our decision to ignore the impact of austerity is political. And our actions shape the inequality that our nation faces. Local authority budget cuts are higher in areas with more child poverty. Okay? And the red dots are the Labour local authorities, and the blue dots are the Conservative ones. Austerity is deliberately targeting and punishing the poor. And when you leave people behind, when groups of people in society feel socially excluded, isolated, that they are not part of mainstream society, that they don't have the same opportunities and chances that other people get, then you create an environment that is ripe for populism and the far right. This is a graph from The Economist. A bit like the World Bank, it's not known for its progressive economic kind of context. But they responded to a challenge on Twitter, which asked, what factor most explains the swing from Democrats to Republicans in the United States in the election that saw Trump elected? And the thing that they found that was most closely correlated with that swing to Republicans was a measure of population health in US counties that combined obesity, diabetes, heavy drinking, lack of physical exercise, and low life expectancy. So it was in those counties with the worst health that we saw the biggest swing to Trump. Slightly turkeys voting for Christmas, because what was he going to do to their health insurance? Inequality most definitely underpinned Brexit. Inequality is fostering right-wing politics in many, many countries. It makes the ground fertile for those sorts of things to happen. So I hope I've convinced you that inequality is a moral issue. The late, great Tony Atkinson, who died in January this year, was the UK's most respected academic studying inequality. And he once said to me and Richard that he didn't really think our kind of work was necessary because you can make a moral argument for equality. And you can make a moral argument for equality, but I think it's really strengthened by the empirical evidence of the damage that it does and the ability to use that evidence to unpick the arguments of those who would tell you that it's okay, it's just human nature, it's a side effect of economic growth, it's needed to provoke aspiration and creativity. It doesn't really matter, only poverty matters. It's just wrong, 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 wrong. I haven't got the benefit of a classical education, but anybody can use Google Images and Wikipedia. And Cicero says, any man can make mistakes, but only an idiot persists in his error. In the UK, in the USA at the moment, we are persisting in our error. I'm going to make a little plug right at the end. The Equality Trust is about to take part in the Big Give, which is a charitable event that starts at the end of this month, 28th of November, and if people give money to the Equality Trust, it doubles. It's the magic money tree that everybody's looking for, really. It has not started yet, but if you would like to donate to a charity that works to campaign and educate around inequality, if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see a link to the Big Give website. And we need that campaigning, educational work to keep going. And very last thing, we've written a new one. This is Richard and my new book. It will be published in June next year. You don't have to buy it really because it's just got everything I've talked to you about in it. Hasn't got anything else. But it will be coming out in June. It takes us a long time to write a book. I was saying to one of your Keele colleagues earlier that we now regard ourselves as the Donna Tartt of non-fiction writing because we can only produce a book every 10 years. But it updates our thinking and attempts to bust these myths about inequality. So I will end there. I'm sorry I've gone on rather longer than you probably hoped I would, and probably all of you hoped I would as well, but I hope we have time for a few questions. Thank you very much for listening.